What is going on, everybody? It is the Icebreaker here, back with another video. For today's video, we are continuing our mini series for our season previews for the NHL 2024-2025 season. In this episode, we are focusing solely on the Metropolitan division. As you know, I'm going to give you guys my standings predictions for this division, the worst team in the Metro up until the best team of the Metropolitan division. So you guys will get a little bit of an idea of who I see making the playoffs, who I see being in the hunt, and who I see at the bottom of this division. Yeah, let's just get right into it. Let's not waste any more time. Kicking things off with 8th in the Metro. Coming in at dead last in the Metro, this is a very difficult team to judge given the circumstances of the sudden passing of Johnny Gaudreau, but I do have the Columbus Blue Jackets here, 29, 42, and 11 for 69 points. Look, it's difficult because of what happened, but at the same time, you look at this roster, and I don't think having them last should come as a surprise to anybody. Now, we all know that the Blue Jackets have absolutely no pressure to do anything this season. I know that the big loss that they had, it's going to take a toll on this group. I feel like it's very reasonable to assume that the Blue Jackets as an organization, as a group, are going to struggle quite a bit this season. It's going to be the most trying season of this franchise, to be quite frank with you guys. But even with Gaudreau, if I'm being honest, I kind of already had prepared all my rankings for every team well beforehand. And even if Gaudreau was still with us, I was prepared to have the Blue Jackets as the worst team in the Eastern Conference anyway. So, yeah, it's tough, but I think they're going to hover around roughly the same as they were last season. I don't think we should expect them to make any sort of significant jump. This is still a relatively young team that is in a rebuilding process, right? But what kind of progress can we expect? Kind of tough to say, again, given the circumstances. But yeah, I honestly don't mind the moves that they made. They added some solid veteran pieces, Monahan and James Van Riemsdyk most recently, and Jordan Harris coming back from the Patrick Laine trade, I think is, decent. Give them some added depth on defense, which they certainly needed. But yeah, this is still a rebuilding team. Not exactly sure kind of where they stand right now. So yeah, looking at their forward group, it's not terrible, but especially with losing your best forward and Gaudreau, arguably your best player. They definitely lack that high-end talent now. Bringing in Monahan, I think, is good to add some center depth. I think maybe if there's a guy that could step up and take the next step in his development, it could be a guy like Adam Fantilli, who, former number 3 overall draft pick by Columbus. Obviously, he was coming off a decent rookie season, kind of hurt a little bit, had missed quite a bit of games, but when he was healthy, he looked pretty solid. So I would expect him to take another step forward. He could be a dark horse candidate to maybe lead the Blue Jackets in scoring. I think it's a very decent possibility that he does uptake his production, maybe hovers around 60 points or something like that. That's kind of where I could envision him, producing this year. Other than that, there are some promising guys, like Ken Johnson's still pretty young, and I think he could take another step forward as well. Boone Jenner is obviously their captain. Perennial 20-goal scorer at the very least, and I see no reason why he shouldn't hit about 25-ish goals again. Kirill Marchenko, I think, is a huge sleeper as well. I think he has 30-goal potential, and I think maybe this season he could be another guy to elevate his game and maybe hit 30-plus goals this season. I don't think that's a huge hot take because he's been trending in that direction the last few years anyway. The rest of their depth is fine to me. Again, Van Riemsdyk's a decent depth add. Cole Sillinger's still pretty young, and I think he's solid in his own right as the third-line center on that team. Overall, it's not the worst forward group, but yeah, they do lack some high-end skill, and that's a big reason why they're probably not in a prime position to really be that competitive this year. And then you look at their defense. Again, some veteran pieces, but it's not the greatest defense, other than Zach Werenski, who I believe is for sure a top 10 defenseman in the NHL, and even he played, I think he missed some games, but in the games he played, he was not far off a point per game, especially on that Blue Jackets team that only had 66 points, were bottom 5 in the NHL, and I still projected them to be there as well this season. But Renski's fantastic. The rest of the defense, again, Jordan Harris, I think, is actually solid. Being a Habs fan, I saw him a lot the last couple of years. Not a flashy guy, but he is very efficient when he is on the ice, and he could be a very capable third pair guy. With the potential of him maybe stealing a top 4 role, because I look at the rest of the D. Ivan Provorov and Damon Severson, yes, they were once good, but these guys are well past the prime of their careers, and these past season, especially Provorov, wasn't the greatest years for them, right? And Juracek had kind of a struggle in his first season, but he's still very young, and I can see him only getting better from here. So, and then Gabranson, yeah, he's not really anything significant in my opinion. Again, another guy past his prime. So the defense can definitely use quite a bit of work, but yeah, so overall the team's not looking the greatest, and I think everyone kind of expected that anyway this season, especially their goaltending. Merzlikins has been one of the worst starters in the NHL, especially the last 3-4 years, really since his rookie year where he was actually really solid. It hasn't quite been the same since. And that's been one of the weak suits for this Blue Jackets team, because they've had years when, even when they were just mediocre, they were a pretty good offensive team, but the goaltending just completely let them down. So I have little to no confidence in Merzlikins and Danil Tarasov as a legit tandem in the NHL. You'd hope that they probably, at least Merzlikins, can bounce back and get back to kind of what he was early on in his career, but I'm very doubtful of that personally. Overall, it's a young team just with a bunch of holes in their lineup, and they're still rebuilding. It's going to be a few years before they are ready to take that step into making the playoffs. But look, with the loss of Johnny Gaudreau, how that is going to affect the organization is something that we cannot foresee right now. But you hope for their sake that they kind of come out better as a team, and they just rally together. It would be one of the most incredible stories in NHL history, quite frankly, if they can somehow rally together and get themselves in a position and maybe even make the playoffs. I don't think it's likely, but if that sort of ignites a fire under this team where they come into the season completely pissed off and they just work their asses off every single night, that would be quite an inspirational story. But as of right now, I just don't think there's enough there. But again, there's like literally no expectations for this team. So I'm going to play it safe, say they're going to be an 8th, but I'm obviously really interested to see how this team performs, and I hope they honestly do a lot better this season, because it's a tough loss. The whole hockey community's feeling it, and I'm rooting for them for sure. Coming in at number 7th here, I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but I think this team is going to start to continually regress now. I got the Pittsburgh Penguins 34-40-8 for 76 points. I do think they're on a downward spiral. If the last 2 seasons were any indication, missing the playoffs, and I think they're the oldest team in the NHL. I can only see that getting worse. I don't envision this team getting any better than where they have been. At best, yes, they could be competing for a playoff spot again, with the off chance of them actually sneaking into a wild card. But with that said, it is a weird feeling betting this low on a team with Sidney Crosby on it, because considering the year he had last season, he went on an absolute tear, especially down the stretch, to keep the Penguins in the hunt for a playoff spot, and they nearly snuck in, but they ultimately missed by about 3 points. Yeah, I have them as one of the worst teams in the league, the second worst team in the East, 27th in the league. So that's pretty low. That's what is that, like bottom 7 or bottom 6? Yeah, that's pretty crazy. With any older roster, Father Time eventually is going to catch up to you. And with Crosby, for example, I don't necessarily see him as a guy that's going to age poorly. I think he has aged well over the course of his 30s, and now he's like 36 or 37 now. I still think he's going to have a north of a point per game season. He just re-signed there for 2 more seasons. His legacy is already secured. It didn't really matter if you want to contend for another cup elsewhere or to just stay in Pittsburgh and probably end his career there, which I commend either way. And he's a fantastic player. He's going to go down as top 5 player all time for sure. You can argue he's higher on the list, but again, that's up for debate. But as for the rest of the core, Malkin has been taking some significant steps back over the last couple of seasons, and I expect that to continue. Have him peaking at about 60 points. I can see his decline being quite prevalent. Erik Karlsson's another guy who's a bit older, and obviously he's not going to be the San Jose 100-point defenseman. I don't think anyone expects that of him. And Letang as well, I think, is another guy that's just going to regress, especially on the offensive end too. So yeah, it's just an older team, not necessarily sure where they're going right now. As we start with the 4 group, like I mentioned, this team really lives and dies with the core of Crosby and Malkin. If those guys are not producing anywhere close to where they have been, then the Penguins obviously have no chance in hell to make the playoffs. But again, I don't think these guys are capable of doing alone, especially at the ages that they are at, being in their mid to late 30s. And it's going to take a lot for this Penguins team to really bounce back and get back into the playoffs. For one, Rickard Rakell has to have a massive bounce back season. I think he was very disappointing last year, considering the year before he had 60 points. This past season, I don't even think he hit 40. His goal totals were essentially cut in half, which is just for a guy like him, it's not acceptable, especially since I would argue he's still technically in the prime of his career. Brian Russ just needs to stay healthy, but when he is healthy, he's fairly efficient. But if he can't stay healthy again, that doesn't help the Penguins at all. Bunting, since coming over, looked really solid. So, there's maybe some hidden, untapped potential there, even though he's a bit older. I think he's like 27 or 28. So we don't know how much better he's going to get. But again, the top six on paper isn't bad, especially trading for Rutger McGroarty, who I think is going to be a solid top six player throughout his entire career. And I can envision him having a really solid rookie season, especially if he's playing with a guy like Crosby or Malkin. Or I don't know where he's going to play, to be honest. Right now they're projecting him with Malkin, but either way, they can probably fluctuate and, shuffle the lines every once in a while. Bottom six, I'm not a huge fan of. There's really little to no offense there. I think Drew O'Connor's decent as a third-line guy, but he's not going to give you a ton of amazing offensive output. Kevin Hayes is definitely on the back nine of his career as well. Cody Glass is definitely kind of a low-risk, high-reward type of player. Just hasn't quite panned out, hasn't lived up to his draft position. And he's definitely going to carve out a role in the NHL for himself, but likely not as a top six forward. And he was projected to be like a number one center for Vegas, and he's probably at his peak, probably a third line guy. So you hope for him he can kind of rejuvenate his career in Pittsburgh. That's another guy that probably is going to have to take his play to the next level if the Penguins are going to remain competitive in that Eastern Conference wildcard hunt. And then the fourth line, it's little to no offense. I mean, Lizotte and Nachari don't really give you anything on that end for the most part. And Lars Eller is obviously past the prime of his career, but as a fourth line center, he's definitely serviceable. Defensively, I think they're actually not as bad as people think. I actually really like Marcus Pettersson and Erik Karlsson on that top pair. And to Erik Karlsson's credit, he actually didn't have the worst defensive year. He's been judged throughout his entire career as being an amazing offensive guy, but a huge defensive liability. This past season, his underlying numbers were actually pretty solid. So if you can have another season like that, that definitely is going to help the Penguins' chances. And as for the rest of the defense, like Grzelcyk and Aho on the third pair, I actually think is really solid. I think Matt Grzelcyk is one of the more underrated defensemen in the league. With Boston, I thought he was extremely underrated, and if he can bring that play to the Penguins, again, that's going to help their defense. Graves and Letang as a second pair, I don't think is bad. Graves did not have the greatest year last year, but I definitely think he has the potential still to be a very solid shutdown defensive guy. As for the goaltending, I mean, it remains the same with Tristan Jarry and Alex Nedeljkovic, but it's frustrating to watch because you know that both these guys are capable of being really solid for stretches, but they're just way too inconsistent, especially Tristan Jarry. I feel like there's still more to give for him, but he just cannot seem to put it together on a consistent basis from season to season. And I don't have confidence that this is a top goaltending tandem. I think it could be decent. It could be great at times, but then there's moments where it looks absolutely atrocious. Again, the inconsistency of goal is a big reason why the Penguins are definitely not looking to be the greatest team this season. And like I said, it's an older roster. It's kind of hard to judge them, and especially the Metro. I think there's other teams that have done better, especially in the offseason. The Penguins, they just didn't do enough for me. Maybe it's a hot take picking the Penguins to be this low in the division, but look, I just have little to no confidence that this team is going to get any better than it has been the last couple of seasons. I don't think their depth is good enough, and their goaltending is inconsistent. And again, if Crosby and Malkin are take any sort of step back, the Penguins are not going to be a playoff team, and that's kind of where I'm predicting. I'm kind of betting on their floor. As a result, have them seventh in this division. Not entirely confident in this Penguins team. Getting into sixth in the Metro, this is another team that I think surprised a lot of people last season and nearly making the playoffs. Having said that, I did think they overachieved to a degree, and I am going to say that I expect a little bit of regression. They're still going to be somewhat competitive, but I don't think they're going to be in the hunt for a playoff spot, in my opinion. So I got the Philadelphia Flyers here, 33, 37, and 12 for 78 points. Now, I give all the credit in the world to how this Flyers team was able to play last season. John Tortorella still proving that even, with his methods, still one of the best coaches in the NHL, and I don't think that could really be disputed, given how he could take a team who kind of lacked that high-end talent, lacked that skill, but to be competitive every single night. And that's why the Flyers, I don't think they're anywhere close to the worst team in the league. I mean, I have them pretty low in the standings, but I still think that they are going to be competitive. When you're hovering around 80 points, you're a competitive team. You're not necessarily a great team, but you're kind of, you're competing sort of in the hunt night to night. The compete is definitely there. That's for sure. That's no question about this team. That's one thing that you can bet on. The Flyers are going to be a competitive team every single game. Like there's no question about that. But again, they lack that high-end talent. Their offense is not great. Their power play has been abysmal, especially the last couple of years. Didn't really make any key additions. I mean, if you want to count Matvei Michkov, that's fine. He has franchise potential. And in my opinion, he is my pick for the Calder Trophy. I think he's going to have a massive season, over 30 goals and 60 points. But yeah, there's just quite a few holes in this roster. So yeah, the forward group, honestly, on paper, it could be a lot worse. But because it lacks that high-end talent, high-end skill, I think that's a huge detriment to this team that's already kind of struggling to be a consistent offensive team anyway. A big reason for that is Sean Couturier. I know, missing the NHL for literally 2 years, not playing. It's tough to really come back from that. But again, he obviously didn't come back quite the same. He had 38 points, I believe, only 11 goals. That has to obviously come up. There is some reason to believe that maybe he could get his game back somewhat to where it was before his injuries. But again, I don't really know if he is ever going to return to being that number one center. But this is ultimately the year for him to prove that he is still that guy. If he is returning to that 30-goal, 70, 75-point player that he was, then the Flyers are definitely back in business and they'll be in the hunt for a playoff spot. They could even sneak in. I don't think it's too hot of a take, especially when you have a guy like John Tortorella behind the bench coaching this team and keeping them competitive every single game. Michkov, of course. I think, again, franchise talent. I think he's going to have a fantastic rookie year. Forster had a decent rookie season. I think he still has 20, 25 goal upside. So I think that's a guy that could take another step. Owen Tippett, I think, is possibly in for maybe the best season of his career, could get to over 30 goals. Again, if the offense comes together, there's a lot of guys with potential to really take a step forward. Morgan Frost, I think, is actually a really solid second-line center and could be in line for about 50 points as well. Konechny, we all know he's their best player. Should hover roughly around a point a game, at the very least, get 70 points. And even like the third line, I thought Bobby Brink was decent in the games he played, and I think hopefully he has more ice time, gets a elevated role, and just is more impactful this season. Lawton's fine as a third line center. Fairby, one of the more underrated players in the league, certainly the most underrated player on the team, in my opinion. And the fourth line is just the shit disturber. Garnet Hathaway, Noah Cates. Kind of struggled last season, but he was building a reputation as being one of the better two-way players in the league. And Ryan Poehling as a fourth liner, I think, is fine. He had the best season of his career with the Flyers last season. So overall, it's a deep forward group, but not necessarily the greatest in terms of high offensive skill. But there's guys with potential there for sure. On defense, I think the numbers would suggest that this is a good defensive team. There is some solid guys. Like Cam York is a guy I think I could take a step forward offensively. Probably going to lead their team in points from that blue line, quarterback, the top power play unit, that is. If the power play is going to be any good, I think York is going to have a massive impact on that. Sanheim is a solid defenseman coming off a great season. Steeler, I think, is underrated. They locked him up long term. I think that was a good, smart move for them, and he's going to be a solidified guy in that top four. Again, they brought in Jamie Drysdale from the Anaheim Ducks. He's had some injury troubles at the early going of his career, which is very concerning considering that the blue line already is dealing with some, injuries of its own right. Ristolainen being a guy, but also he hasn't really been that consistent over the course of his career. But at the same time, just to have the body there, it's helpful, right? You don't want to have guys go down with injury, right? So hopefully Drysdale has a fully healthy season and he can get back to kind of what he was with the Ducks, especially in his rookie year. I thought he was really solid. Blue line is decent. It's not the greatest though, but they can live with that, I think, just because their team is good enough defensively and they've done their job well. Goaltending to me is a massive concern. Obviously, with Carter Hart no longer a part of the team, there's huge shoes. The shoes are there to fill. There's a lot of shoes to fill there. Samuel Urson, I think, is more of a fringe backup. I wasn't particularly impressed with him this past season. He had his moments where he looked fantastic, but for the most part, he was just a non-option. And Ivan Fedotov is a young guy one of their goaltending prospects. He could be a guy that maybe steals the starter as the season goes on. But again, so much uncertainty with the goaltending, and that's a big reason why I think they're going to regress, because a big reason why they had a great first half of the season is because Carter Hart was really solid. But really, since he left the team, maybe that whole situation was a bit of distraction, but the goaltending just could not keep up, especially because the offense, they weren't getting a ton from their forward group. Throughout the course of the entire season, quite frankly, was a big reason why their team ultimately regressed. And I think just for a full season with this goaltending, I just don't think it's going to cut it. And that's a huge reason why I think the Flyers are definitely in line to take a significant step back this year. As it stands right now, like I said, they're going to be competitive, but ultimately, I just don't think that the roster is good enough to really make any sort of noise in the East and make the playoffs. But I do like a lot of the pieces that they have. And like I said, their future is bright if they continue this rebuild properly and they make good decisions in the front office. This team's going to be good. But as of right now, just too many question marks for me. And as a result, I got them 6th in the Metro. Coming in at 5th, this is kind of getting into the teams that I think are going to legitimately be competing for a playoff spot. I got the Washington Capitals in 5th, though, 39, 33, and 10 for 88 points. This could be seen as a hot take. I might lose some people here considering how significantly they improved this offseason and the fact that they made the playoffs last year with 91 points. Maybe people are not going to understand my thought process and them having 3 less points than they did last season when their team is objectively significantly better, but I'll explain it. But yeah, I can commend the front office for making, these type of additions, adding Jacob Chychrun and trade, Logan Thompson, Pierre-Luc Dubois in exchange for Darcy Kemper. I think that definitely improves their center depth. Andrew Mangiapane added another, middle 6 winger at the very least. A lot of great upgrades, in my opinion, to make this team a lot more balanced and well-rounded than it was last season. But for me, I just think this team massively overachieved last year. Like, if you look at that roster and how the team played throughout the season, they weren't even really that good. Their goal differential was like well in the minuses. It was pretty bad. They were literally a bottom 5 offensive team, but because they won so many close games, they were able to pick up, points that way, and they snuck into the playoffs by the skin of their teeth. And I guess if it wasn't for Tortorella pulling the goalie, the Red Wings would have been in the playoffs. But that's not to discredit the Capitals. I mean, they got in the playoffs. You have to credit any team that makes the playoffs. So yeah, look, I just thought that team probably should have been in the high 70s, low 80s in points, and they just massively overachieved to the point where it was like 91 was just too high for them. In my opinion, I think that was just too high. As for this season, I just think because they overachieved so much last year, even though they improved, I think this is roughly where they should be. Like, kind of how they achieved last season is where I think they should be roughly this year. So they could be in the high 80s, low 90s. So I have them kind of on the lower side of that, 88 points. Despite all the upgrades, I'm still not convinced that this team is a threat. Again, I'm not a huge fan of where the Metro is going this season in terms of all the teams in the Metro. I think it's a division that's rapidly on the decline. And the Capitals are still a relatively veteran-induced group. You never know what to expect when you have an offseason like that with such a roster overhaul. You can't assume that it's going to be a flawless transition just like that. Like, there could be a lot of things that go wrong. Guys just don't fit with their new franchises. It's just a lot to ask to assume that because this team got better on paper that everything's just going to come together in a blink of an eye. And it could take some time for this team to really find their footing. And there's a big reason why I could see them maybe getting off to not as great of a start as people anticipate. So yes, the additions of Pierre-Luc Dubois and Andrew Mangiapane definitely should improve the forward group on paper at least. But this is still not a team that I'm convinced is going to score a ton of goals. I don't think either of those guys are going to be like game changers necessarily. Ovechkin has already shown that he's going to be on the decline. I think just given how he played last season, I know he was better in the second half, but to expect a guy who's 38, 39 years old to still give you 40 goals, I think it's egregious to even assume that he's going to get back to that level. He just didn't look like himself at all. And I'm more on the pessimistic side of him, like getting that goal scoring record. I think there's a legit possibility that he doesn't get to it unless he decides that he needs to play another 4 or 5 seasons, because I think his goal scoring is rapidly going to continue to decline, and I'm just not sold on the offense around him. Dylan Strome is fine as a top line center. I mean, I personally believe he's more of a second line guy, but if he gets you about 60 points, I think Capitals fans would be fine with that because that's kind of his ceiling for the most part. Wilson, in his, I guess he's like 30, 31. He gives you decent production, but again, not a needle mover necessarily. They need some guys to step up on the young side. Connor McMichael needs to take a step forward. Hendrix Lapierre, another guy that need to elevate their game, so the Capitals can be a much more prominent offensive team. But again, then you look at Pierre-Luc Dubois coming off a really disappointing year with the Kings. Can he bounce back? That's the question. There's a lot of uncertainty with this guy because he's shown signs that he could be a solid second line guy, hover around 60 points, but he's shown things like he did, towards the end of his career in Columbus, very disappointing. And then, of course, last year with the Kings, he only had 40 points, but obviously he's going to get a bigger role here, but there's no guarantee that he does have that quote-unquote breakout season and gets you like 70, 80 points. I just don't see that happening, especially with the roster and the talent around him. I don't think like it's anywhere close to the level of guys that he had with even the Kings. There's a lot of really solid offensive pieces. And with Winnipeg too, like this is one of the more weaker offensive teams he's been a part of. So to expect him to be like an 80-point guy, I think is asking for quite a bit too much there. Radish is decent. Sonny Milano coming back, I think he's a decent third liner. But yeah, I'm not really convinced that this team is going to score any more goals than they did last season. I still think that in all likelihood, they'll probably rank in the bottom 10 offense. And if you rank that low in terms of offense, that is a definitely tough sell to make the playoffs unless their defense comes scared and their goaltending is fantastic. On the blue line, I love the Matt Roy addition. I think that's a very solid addition for them. To have him paired with Rasmus Sandin on the second pair is good. Chychrun for Jensen. I'm kind of wishy-washy on this, I'll be honest, because John Carlson is good offensively. I definitely think he probably won't be eating as many minutes, which will help him, but he's not really known for being great defensively. And neither is Chychrun. I mean, he had good offensive numbers, but he was absolutely awful defensively last year with the Ottawa Senators. Now, maybe the system in Washington is different, and he will be able to improve from that side of the ice. But look, I don't think that top pair is necessarily going to be as good as people think. I think they'll probably get their numbers, and Chychrun is known for being good offensively and getting his numbers. He'll get his, but this to me is not a good defensive top pair. And if those are the top guys that you're expected to shut down other players on other teams, I think people are going to be disappointed quite a bit. I just don't think those guys are going to be able to defend very well. I don't think either of them have ever been great defenders at any point of their careers. So yeah, I think the defense actually might be a little bit overrated, to be honest, especially with Chychrun. I think Nick Jensen brought a defensive element to that team that I think is actually going to be sorely missed. And even though Matt Roy coming in is a help, I don't think he's a replacement, right? And again, Chychrun can add offense, but he's not the greatest defensively unless that part of the game is significantly improved. I don't necessarily believe that this defense is any better than it was last year, to be honest. I think it's just paper ads, flashy ads, but is it better? Not entirely convinced. But the goaltending, in my opinion, is probably their strongest suit on this team. Charlie Lindgren was really good last year. To expect him to have the same season, again, not sold on that. Goaltending, very volatile from year on year. And Logan Thompson just didn't look like himself with the Vegas Golden Knights, and that's a big reason why they parted ways with him. But if he can kind of rediscover himself and get back to what he was really in his rookie season, I think was his best year. The goaltending, I think, is going to be fine, though. And ultimately, I think that's the reason why the Capitals are going to be in a lot of games. And they have some decent enough offensive guys where they can, score the way out of troubles some nights, but still not an elite offensive team. But look, this is a very vastly improved team. They're going to be competitive. Are they a playoff team? I don't think it's a shoo-in, and I don't think it's a hot take to assume that this team, despite all the additions they made, could still miss the playoffs. I commend the front office for at least trying to keep this team competitive as Ovechkin enters the waning stretches of his career. But ultimately, I'm not sold on their moves. I don't think that it's going to necessarily get them into the playoffs. And just given where the division is, I think a lot of teams are actually getting weaker, quite frankly, and I have more faith in the Atlantic Division. as I personally have 5 teams coming out of the Atlantic into the playoffs and only 3. And the Capitals are just a team that I'm not sold on offensively. I don't think they're that great, even with their additions. And there's too much to ask for this roster overhaul to expect everything to kind of click. So I'm on the pessimistic side from this team. Let me know your thoughts. Maybe you guys disagree, but I'm not really sold on this Capitals team making the playoffs this year, and that's why I have them missing. I got them 5th. 4th in the Metro now, kind of hovering around the same as last season. I think they'll be in the hunt for a playoff spot, but ultimately this time I do have them missing the playoffs. I got the New York Islanders 4th in the division, 37, 30, and 15 for 89 points. Another veteran team that I don't think is really that great. I mean, last season was a 94-point season. They were 3rd in the Metro. To me, that's kind of their ceiling. This is not a Stanley Cup contender. They're not the team they were from a few years back when they went to back-to-back Eastern Conference Finals. Again, this team, it wouldn't surprise me if they made the playoffs again. I think they definitely have the capabilities of doing it. I mean, their roster is solid. They have good defense. Goaltending is fantastic when it's healthy. And the forward group, again, it's not flashy, but there's certain guys on the team that are capable of producing and carrying the load offensively. So, like, there's a world where the Islanders could still make the playoffs. I'm just a little bit lower on them compared to other teams in the wild card hunt. But yeah, I just don't see this team as any better as they were last season. I mean, again, they lost some depth on the fence, which I guess could hurt, especially there's been some durability issues, especially with a guy like Adam Pelech and Ryan Pollock, some guys that haven't been really super healthy the last couple of seasons. And, they've been kind of the faces of that blue line for many years when they were like top of the league, or at least, going deep in the playoffs. Now, Noah Dobson's obviously their top guy, but those two guys, not being healthy, like that hurts their defensive depth, but hopefully they are healthy this year. Their only main addition really is Anthony Duclair, which I think could be solid. I mean, he has had stretches where he's played really well. I think down the stretch with Tampa, he was like actually really, really good. So he could be a guy that maybe produces a lot better than I have him projected at with the Islanders, because he's definitely going to be playing top 6 minutes again. But again, there's a lot of older guys and guys that had like career years, like Kyle Palmieri had 30 goals this past season. He's an older guy. I don't necessarily expect him to do that again this year. I mean, he still could. I mean, he's not the oldest guy in the league, but he is getting up there in age. He's in his mid-30s now. I don't know. I just think that 30 goals is a lot to ask for him to do in back-to-back seasons. But again, Bo Horvat, is a really solid number 1 center. Can get you about 30 goals, 60 to 70 points on a good year. I think he has that capability. Barzal's obviously their best player, most skilled player, one of the better playmakers in the league. I guess if he had more offensive talent surrounding him, this guy could easily put up 90, 100 points, but the Islanders just don't play that system. They don't play that style of hockey. They haven't really over the last few years. But he's still capable of being nearly a point per game guy. And him transitioning to the wing, I think, has actually done good things for him, as he's been able to kind of, I guess, not be so pressured to play defense and just focus on what he's good at, and that's, creating offense for others. Brock Nelson, I think, is one of the more underrated players in the league. You can argue he is the most underrated player in the league. He's fantastic as a second-line center. I'd argue he's the best second-line center in the NHL, but I'd have to think about it, but he's definitely up there for sure. And the depth is fine. Like Engvall, I think, is decent. Pajot, Lee, it's decent third line. But again, there's not a ton of like firepower on the offensive end outside of like Barzal, Horvat, and Nelson. It's a bit concerning if they can get that secondary scoring. I think that definitely helps their case. But it's not the greatest offense, that's for sure. On defense, though, I think they're solid with their defense. Again, Pelech and Pollock, if they're healthy, that definitely helps. If not, that's going to hurt. Romanov is decent. Dobson's their best offensive defenseman, not the greatest defensively. It's not what it used to be. So again, that's another reason why I think they could decline a bit, because the defense is just, they had that structure under Barry Trotz especially, and they just haven't been quite the same team. They've been able to make the playoffs, but they've always kind of faltered in the first round. Is this defense going to take you to the promised land? As it currently stands, I'm not 100% sure, but again, it's not their weakest thing. I think goal scoring is probably their weakest suit on this team. Their strongest suit for sure, the strongest aspect is their goaltending. Like Ilya Sorokin, he had a bit of an off year, but if he's coming back from his he had some surgery, I believe, in the offseason, so hopefully that doesn't affect him too much. But Varlamov is a steady, capable backup and can take the reins as a starter, as we saw last year, right? He played pretty much in the playoffs, right? But Sorokin probably still is their starter. But yeah, as a tandem, it's probably the best tandem in the league still. And the goaltending, it could be as fantastic as I expect it to be. If it is that, I think the Islanders are definitely going to be competitive. If those guys are fantastic, they could even make the playoffs. Wouldn't surprise me. Like the roster is not bad, but yeah, I think it's just another year older with this core. I don't see them as really any better. I think them being kind of a wild card, low to mid 90s point team is kind of their peak, kind of their ceiling. It's kind of hard to argue against the Islanders because they prove it every year that they could still be a competitive team, or they could still be a playoff team. But yeah, I'm just picking them to miss. Getting into the top three in the Metro, these three teams I do have making the playoffs. Third, I got the Carolina Hurricanes. I have them taking quite a bit of a step back, but I still think they're good enough to make the playoffs. I got them 45, 29, and 8 for 98 points. They'll hover around 100. They kind of had a bit of an overhaul this offseason. They lost a lot of pieces, which is why I think they could be in line to regress quite a bit. First and foremost, I think coaching plays a huge factor in this team's success. And Rod Brind'Amour, in my opinion, is the best coach in the NHL. But obviously, Sebastian Aho is their best player, and he is a guy that can score north of a point per game. Because I think there is going to be more pressure on him in particular to maybe carry the load offensively, since I kind of feel like up front they're sort of depleted now with the losses of Jake Gensel and Teuvo Teravainen. I think Aho's in line to having probably the best season of his career. So I have him scoring like 95 points, and I don't think that's a hot take because I think Aho definitely has that ceiling to be a guy who can hover around 95 to 100, at his peak. And I think he is kind of in the prime of his career now. And I think there's going to be more expected of him to kind of be the main catalyst offensively for that team. But again, Svechnikov is there. Seth Jarvis is there, just locked up long-term there. And I think Jarvis is another underrated guy. That top line is fantastic. Do I think they're a Stanley Cup contender? No, I don't. I think last year was their best shot with the talent that they had and that they kind of blew it. I honestly, I think their window for a Stanley Cup might be closing unless the next couple of years they have other guys in the lineup that emerge as surefire top four defensemen or top six forwards that can really drive the team, take them to another level, and keep them afloat offensively and defensively, because they did lose some really big pieces on defense in Brett Pesce and Brady Shea. But yeah, that's a big reason why I have Aho having such a massive season, because I look at this forward group. Honestly, it's not as good as I would have thought, to be honest. I mean, losing Gensel and Teravainen definitely hurts, but yeah, after that top line, it's looking kind of bleak. The offense, I don't see a ton of guys there that are capable of being like key contributors, apart from Martin Necas, who was coming off somewhat of a disappointing season. I think he can bounce back and get to at least like 60 points. But after that, like Kotkaniemi, been very inconsistent over the course of his career. Is he a number 2 center, or is he just like a bottom 6 forward, third line center at best? Kind of hard to tell, but he's another guy that probably would have to contribute a bit more if this Hurricanes team is going to remain afloat and be as dominant as they have been in the past 3-4 years. But bottom 6, not a huge fan of it. Like, they're guys that, they know their roles and they're all like really solid two-way players, but offensively, there's not a ton there of guys who can contribute consistently, apart from maybe Jack Roslovic, but even him, like, he's coming off like 9 goals, 30-ish points. Like, yeah, there's not going to be a ton of contributions for the secondary scoring, in my opinion. But again, it's a forward group. They know their roles. They're key contributors in what they do. Again, the top line is going to have to be amazing. But again, the rest of the team is solid enough where I still think they're good enough. Like, even with the loss of Brett Pesce and Brady Shea, which are huge losses, they still have Orlov and Walker. They brought in Sean Walker, I think, is actually really underrated, and it could be a decent replacement. Again, they play a good defensive style of hockey, so I feel like those losses won't be as prevalent as people might think, just given that the team is just known for playing good defense. And if the coach gets these guys to buy in and play their system, I think they'll turn out just fine. I like Shane Gostisbehere as well to maybe quarterback either the top or second unit on their power play, because he was like a big reason why the Detroit Red Wings power play was top 10 last season. And they still have Brett Burns, who, although is a little bit older, can still produce some offense. And Jacob Slavin is the most underrated defenseman in the league. So, like, the defense is still really solid. And goaltending, it really comes down to their health. But I think Frederik Andersen and Pyotr Kochetkov, when healthy, are a really solid tandem. Now, again, they're not going to dominate like they have in years past. I don't think they're a top 2 team in this division. But do I think they're going to miss the playoffs? Absolutely not. I know there's a lot of people that are actually going like super hot takes with this and saying that the Hurricanes might actually miss the playoffs. I could see why, because the lineup does look depleted on paper, but you can't really judge a hockey team based on paper. And the Hurricanes have always been one of, if not the best, like analytical team in the NHL. And I don't really expect that to change, just given the roster that they have, the coaching that they have. This team is going to find ways to win games, and I still think they're going to make the playoffs. Coming in at second in the Metro Division, having a massive bounce-back season and getting back into the playoffs. This is a sexy pick by many folks. I'm going with the New Jersey Devils, 49, 26, and 7 for 105 points. I think they are more so the team that they were 2 years ago than they were last season, especially with the additions that they made. This team is in prime position to getting back into the postseason. Now, having said that, you can make the argument that this team is still overrated quite a bit because there are some concerns about the direction of the goaltending that they have. I mean, I like that they added Jacob Markstrom to complement Jake Allen. They have a steady tandem, at least on paper. But these are both guys who are in their mid-30s now, both of which have a bit of injury history. And yes, I think those are huge additions to getting this team back into the playoffs, because a big reason why this team missed the playoffs was goaltending, and number 2 was health. A lot of the guys just were not healthy. But you look at the track record of Markstrom and Allen, both guys have had moments where they can play solid, but they also had moments where they've struggled quite a bit. And, you know, I don't have necessarily the fullest of confidence that those 2 guys are going to be like difference makers to the point where they're like in Vezina conversations or like top 10 goalies in the league. Like, I think they could be serviceable and improving the goaltending, but there's also a scary feeling that, you know, it's possible that those guys just don't fit in the New Jersey system. And I could see a world where the goaltending struggles yet again, even given the fact that they added 2 guys who, you know, are solid pieces. But yeah, there's world to believe that maybe the Devils goaltending is a little bit overhyped, in my opinion. But you look at the rest of this roster, and there really shouldn't be any excuse for this team, at least not to bounce back and make the playoffs, even if the goaltending isn't necessarily like the answer per se, right? But you look at the forward group, if it's healthy, Nico Hischier, Jack Hughes, fantastic 1-2 punch. Jack Hughes is a superstar in this league. Hischier is one of the better 2-way centermen. You got Jesper Bratt, who had a north of point per game season this past year. Fantastic player. Timo Meier came on the second half of the year, and if he has a full, consistent, healthy season, he can be a guy that can get you between 30 and 40 goals and 60 to 70 points. So, again, the top 6 looks better. But yeah, Dawson Mercer's another guy that I expect to bounce back. I think coming off a really disappointing 33-point season, although he had 20 goals. Still, I think there's more there for him, and he's definitely given, if he's going to be playing in a top 6 role, that should definitely help him to improve his numbers and just be more of a, you know, positive contributor to this Devils squad. Bottom 6 to me is actually pretty solid. Tatar, Haula, and Nason as a third line I think is actually decent, especially Tatar and Haula can still give you some offense. And the fourth line I think is actually pretty good with the depth that it is. The shit disturbing line, Lazar as a fourth line center I think is decent. Paul Cotter I think is an underrated player. And Nathan Bastian's fine too. So the forward group looks really solid. It's a lot better certainly than it was last season, in my opinion. And if it's healthy, I think the Devils are going to score quite a lot of goals. But defensively, they got significantly better now. Again, on paper, right now on paper, they got better. Can it come together on the ice? That remains to be seen, especially with Luke Hughes expected to miss probably the first month or so of the season. That's definitely a huge loss for them on the offensive end. But again, Dougie Hamilton coming back could easily replace him on that top unit. When he is healthy, he's a guy that can contribute and give you 60 to 70 points as a defenseman, which is fantastic. And Jonas Siegenthaler is one of the better defensive guys, so that as a top pair is solid. But you add in Brett Pesce, you add in Brendan Dillon, Jonathan Kovacevic, which is fine as like a third pair guy, and Simon Nemec, who, former second overall draft pick, who has a really high ceiling to be a top pair defenseman once he hits his peak. The team on paper looks really solid. Again, the goaltending, Again, on paper, it looks better, but there's reasons to believe that Markstrom and Allen could still struggle. They've struggled in the past. Now they have probably a better defense in front of him, but Markstrom has shown inconsistencies with Calgary. Even when Calgary has had, there's been years where Calgary's had a really strong defense group. So it's not necessarily to say that he's going to be fantastic just because he's coming to a new franchise with quote unquote better defense in front of him. As for Jake Allen, I mean, he played really well since coming over from Montreal down the stretch last year. Can he sustain that as the backup? That remains to be seen because it is a veteran goaltending tandem, and these guys have had trouble staying healthy at points in their careers, especially the last few years. You hope that doesn't, come back to bite the team, adding them to the roster. But overall, this is a really solid team. They should bounce back. The question is, will they? Because I still think that there is an argument to be made that this is an overrated team entering this season. Do I think they're a playoff team? Yes. Do I think they should make the playoffs? Are they a lock? I really do believe so. I think the roster is complete as ever. But again, I playing devil's advocate, I could see why there's things that could go wrong as well. But people calling this team a contender, I think we need to pump the brakes. We have not seen this team go on a deep playoff run yet to this point, especially coming off a year where they were only an 81-point team. Unless they go on a deep playoff run, you can't automatically assume this team is a contender, especially when there's still like reasons for concern for like health issues. And again, if the goaltending doesn't solve itself, that's a huge problem, obviously. But again, this is a playoff team. I think they're definitely in prime position to bounce back. And let's hope for their sake that they do. But coming first in the Metro Division, I still believe this division is the New York Rangers to lose. I got them with 52, 24, and 6 for 110 points. Kind of sort of about the same as last season. I know they won the President's Trophy. I think they could hover around that range again. This is just a complete roster from the top down. And I think they are clearly the best team in this division. Have them winning the Eastern Conference once again. And I think they are in prime position to go on yet another deep playoff run. They've been to 2 Eastern Conference finals in the last 3 seasons. And this is a team that I definitely think has potential to win a Stanley Cup at some point in the next couple of years. Can they do it? That remains to be seen. But this, for me, is the one team in this division that I believe is a surefire Stanley Cup contender. Like, yeah, you can argue the Devils if things go right. But with the Rangers, there's no doubt in my mind that this team should be in contention for the Stanley Cup and one of the few teams that I can legitimately envision winning the Stanley Cup as it currently stands. Up front, they're pretty solid right now, especially on their top 6. Artemi Panarin coming off a 120-point season. Is he going to replicate that? I'm not sure. 49 goals is a bit high for him. He's not really a guy who's known to score a ton, but if he continues to shoot the puck like he did last season, maybe he can hover around that again and be just as dominant. Vincent Trocheck had an amazing season centering Artemi Panarin's line. And yeah, right now they have him that projected as the first line because Trocheck maybe outplayed Zibanejad at points, especially in the playoffs. So I like that. Lafreniere took a step forward, and I think he could take yet another step forward and be a guy that can hover between 60 and 70 points and really cement himself as like they did right on drafting him first overall. I don't know if he's ever going to be a franchise talent, but can he be a top line contributor consistently? I think that's a reasonable possibility for that. And then Zibanejad and Chris Kreider, solid duo together for years. Riley Smith coming over from Pittsburgh, kind of coming off a really disappointing year. I think with this Rangers core and with the guys that he's going to be playing with, I can envision him bouncing back and getting back to, hopefully 20 to 25 goals and 50 or so points, hopefully. And yeah, as for the bottom 6, it's not a ton of offense there, but Philip Hedl coming back, I think, is huge. And I think he could be in prime position to maybe taking a step forward. Again, Capo Caco, it's not looking great. I'm not really sure what his ceiling is at this point. It's been years where he hasn't really come into his own yet. I think, he had one good season where he had, I believe, 20 goals, 40-ish points. So hopefully if he can get back to that at least, that would be a win for a third liner. But yeah, it's not looking good for him. But as for the rest of the group, like Cooley is decent. I think VC can give you a little bit of offense. And then Remp, gives the Rangers a little bit of size up front because they've been lacking that kind of toughness, and he definitely provides that. So in a way, he's a positive addition for the Rangers, and I think it's technically going to be his rookie year this upcoming season, and we'll see if he can continue, the spark that he ignited this Rangers team late last year. As for the defense, again, I still think there's some work to be done there, but overall, it's not bad, especially when you have Adam Fox, who is arguably a top 3 defenseman in the NHL in any given season and always in Norris Trophy conversations. Trouba, he had a bit of a rough season. I think he nixed a trade to Detroit. I mean, he's coming back as their captain still. Like, he could still provide a physical presence, but you hope he has a better season than he did last year. Obviously, Lindgren's a solid top pair guy to complement Adam Fox. Andre Miller, solid guy coming into his own. Definitely, for sure, a top 4 defenseman in this league. Yeah, this is a solid roster. And then, of course, Igor Shesterkin as the starter, arguably the best goaltender in the NHL. And Jonathan Quick coming off a really good, solid season as the backup. Can you repeat that? Who knows? But overall, I think they're fine, especially with Shesterkin if he plays consistent all year. Just a very well-rounded team. I don't know really what else I can say about this Rangers team. They just have all the pieces in place for them to go on another deep Stanley Cup playoff run. Now, for their sake, I do hope that this team does eventually win a Stanley Cup because for the most part, this is kind of a veteran group and there's a lot of like older guys on this team. But right now, a lot of those guys are in the prime of their careers. The time is now for the Rangers to win a Stanley Cup. They have a window here for the next maybe 3 or 4 years, I would say. But they're definitely in prime position to at least win one championship over the next few seasons. And let's see if they do it. All right, with that, that is going to wrap up this video of my Metropolitan Division standings predictions for the 2024-2025 NHL season. Let me know if you agree with these picks, disagree with them. Sound off in the comments if you like. I'm engaged to the the debates or whatever. It's all good with me. It's all in good fun. You're all entitled to your own opinions, as I am to mine. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please leave a like on this video if you liked it, considering subscribing to the channel as well, and I will talk to you in the next one.